Well, good morning, Father's House friends and family. Welcome once again to our Sunday morning video service. We're glad you all could join us once again. I hope you're all enjoying this hot summer weather. It's probably not going to be around for long, and I hope the fires simmer down so we don't have bad air quality too. We're getting ready to gear up for our National Back to Church Sunday coming up here September 19th. So I'm going to do the kickoff. I'm going to invite each and every one of you to come to church on that Sunday and celebrate National Back to Church Sunday with us. Other than that, we have our regulars. Our men's meeting is Monday nights on Zoom at 6:30. If you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl or Pastor Carlos know. They'll hook you up with that. Our women's group is meeting on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let Deanna or I know, and we'd love to have you join us and be part of it. Today is our Mission Sunday. This morning, Pastor Mario sent over the cutest video of the kids at the Bible study that they're holding in Argentina. Pastor Juan and Pastor Patricia, you guys are doing a fantastic job, and thank you for sharing the video. We're going to share it in church tomorrow, or today, tomorrow. Anyway, you know how to give. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, set it up as a one-time or a recurring gift. You can give to our Argentina and India missions that way also. I know Pastor Juan appreciates every dime that's going to them as they complete the church and the orphanage that they're working on over there. You can give your regular tithes and offerings. You can write a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road and send it to 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you'd like Pastor Carl and I to come by and pick it up, we'd love to see your smiling faces and love to have you. And once again, thank you for your generosity during this time. We understand that it's tough for some people, but it's tough for the Father's House too, so we appreciate it. Thank you and have a great day. We'll be turning the time over to our guest speaker now. Once again, we'll be hearing from John Mark.
Well, good morning, Father's House. It's good to be back with you again as we talk about the life of Jesus. I hope you're having had a great week and you're having a great weekend, and I trust that you'll have a great weekend next week as well. With that being said, I just wanted to say again, as we're finishing up here, I've only got, I think, 2 more weeks with you, and I'm scheduled to be somewhere else and talk about and tell my story about the life of Jesus other places. But it's really, really been good to have Pastor Carl invite me here so that I could share this time with you and talk about what I witnessed in the life of Jesus Christ of the time when he was alive. Again, my name is Mark. My total name is John Mark. My full name, John Mark. Most people call me Mark. I kind of like John Mark, but I'm okay with it if people call me Mark. And it's true that I was alive at the time that Jesus was walking the earth. I've talked about from the very beginning how whenever anybody ever met Jesus and came into any kind of a real encounter with Jesus, that their life was changed forever if they would open themselves up to him. And see, part of it is that for us to really enter into a relationship with God at any level, then we've got to be receptive to the notion of God, receptive to the idea that God does exist and that he desires a relationship with us. Anyway, we've been talking about that in the context of Jesus Christ, who was the Son of God. And really what I've done is I'm coming here, and what I want to do is I'm really wanting to convince you that after I tell my story about what happened in the life of Jesus, that you would become a follower in him and a believer in him the same way that I am, believing that he surely was the Son of God and all that entails, which, there's really a lot there if we want to think about what it means to be the Son of God. But my purpose isn't to talk about that today, nor through what I've done in the past in these messages, nor next week when I finish up talking about the life of Jesus. But my plan here has been just simply to present the beautiful, beautiful nature of who Jesus was and God's plan through Jesus Christ that he wanted to accomplish for us because he loved us, meaning humanity, his cosmos, everything that he created. See, God doesn't create anything that he doesn't love. He loves everything, all of his creation. And with us being men who have the ability, like no other species that we know of, to be able to interact with God and have meaningful conversation with God above what we know about other animals, puts us kind of in this special category. Well, with that, then we can understand a little bit more about God than, say, an animal like a dog or a whale, they seem to have some kind of communication with one another, or dolphins. But we'll leave that for now, and let's talk a little bit more about what it is that God was trying to communicate us through this person of Jesus Christ. Now, you remember we left off last week, we left Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Judas had gone to the religious leaders to betray Jesus. And Jesus was in the garden and he was praying with his disciples, and he had to work through that. He really had to work through on his human side what it meant that was going to happen to him by way of his death that was going to happen just hours from that time when he was in the garden. It's interesting because there's really two things that I want to say. I want to say, first of all, that in that garden experience, Jesus had to say yes to the will of God. It's in some cases, if you go back to the life of Jesus before Jesus was born, on this planet, although he was pre-existent in the form of God, but coming through birth by the way of Mary, the Virgin Mary. What's interesting to see in the story of Mary is that Mary also had to give consent to God to impregnate her. In other words, God wasn't going to, by the power of the Holy Spirit, impregnate her if it wasn't something that she was willing to do. So she had to say yes to God. The same way that in the garden now, some 30 years later, Jesus has to say yes to God, again concerning his own life and about what it is that God wants to accomplish through his death, which was his resurrection and his lordship over all of creation. So we're kind of starting to get into that now. Jesus has said yes to God in the garden. He had prayed 3 times, Father, if there's any way that I don't have to go to the cross and die, if there's any way to avoid this, then Lord, I'm asking you to find another way. And then he prays his prayer but nonetheless, if it's fitting for you to do this, if it's your will, and I use that word fitting in a very direct way, but if it's fitting for you to do this, if it's your will to do this, if it seems fitting to you, Father, to do this, then because of my love for you and my submission to you, I'd say, let your will be done and not mine. Well, at that time, then he came back and found his disciples sleeping. And he said, you couldn't pray with me for 1 hour. Get up, because the hour of my betrayal is now upon us. So we talked about most of that last week, but now here goes his betrayal with Judas, who's been out, gathered a gang of thugs, and came back to the garden to find Jesus. And so they came to find Jesus that day. I was there. But when he came, I have to admit that at that point I had undressed and gotten asleep. I fell asleep. I was laying there like the other disciples. I'd fallen up the rear with him, and I had taken off my clothes. I figured we were bedding down there for the night, so I got underneath a couple of blankets and I fell asleep there until I heard the clamor. And all of a sudden I heard this clamor, and as the clamor was going about, I saw and I looked and I could see that Judas was there, and Judas walked up to Jesus and he called him Lord, and he gave him a kiss. And Jesus looked at him and he said, certainly, how is it that you betray me with a kiss? But it wasn't just Judas that was there. There was this gang of other guards and people, that authority figures, I guess, that were there. And they were going to arrest Jesus and they were going to take him away. And so at that time, Peter and the other disciples woke up, and one of them had a sword, and he reached over and he took a slice at one of the servants of the high priest that was there. I knew the guy because I'd seen him around, and he cut his ear, and Jesus said, stop it. Let's just stop the madness. And he turned to those that were coming to get him, and he said, I have a question to ask you. And he said, how is it that I have shown you and taught, I've shown you who I am. I've been teaching in the temple in public all of these days. Why is it that you come out to a garden like this when you know all I'm doing is talking about the things of God, to arrest me like I'm some kind of a common thief, a robber. And being a robber, that you had to come now, and you had to come out with swords and armed weapons to take me in. And he just kind of looked at me and said, "Why didn't you just arrest me in the temple when I was talking?" Well, they wouldn't have done that, because if they would have done that, then what would have happened is that the crowd would have been very upset, because they would have felt like they were picking on Jesus. So Jesus kind of looks at me and says, what you guys don't realize, both those who are trying to cut off the servant's ear and trying to fight for him at that time, and for those that were coming to get him and betray, and the betrayer, Judas, who had betrayed him with a kiss, and what he said, which was a very profound thing, he says, what you don't realize is everything that's going on here right now, he said, this has already been preordained by my Father. It's already been written by the prophets. So what you're doing to me today is only to fulfill that which had to happen in God's plan of things anyway. The minute I said yes to the Father is the minute that you showed up, because I knew, and he knew, that the divine and appointed time was there. So you come in the darkness to get me, and so you come by night to get me. And I want to tell you something. He says kind of an odd thing, and he talks about the idea of, and the powers of darkness are upon you in this hour. And it was almost like the idea of saying, you've won the hour. This has been my destiny. And it's been given to you the power by God, by the dark forces, to be able to do what you're going to do to me in the next couple of hours. So at that time then, they took Jesus away after he said that. And they took him to the high priest Caiaphas' house. Now, when they were at Caiaphas' house, as they began to take him, and he got there, all of the disciples, they scattered. So everybody left, and once everybody scattered, I was still there, and I started following from a distance. Well, they noticed that I was following from a distance, and so one of the guards came and he ran after me. And he went out to grab me, and he sees me, and he grabbed this sheet that I had on, because like I said, I'd left my clothes there, but I wanted to see what was going on. And I realized, man, they were going to get me too. And so as he grabbed the sheet, I let the sheet go, and I ran out into the bushes without any clothes on. Sorry to say, but that actually happened to me at that time. And I had to wait for them to leave and get my clothes on and then go about the rest of what was going to happen. But again, they had taken Jesus to Caiaphas' house. All the disciples had scattered. But Peter kind of came to his senses. And when he came to his senses, he decided that he was going to go to where Jesus was. And so he was kind of hanging out in the courtyard area. And when they took Jesus in, they had taken him into the high priest area. And so all of the religious officials were there. And they were trying to find a reason to have Jesus killed, because they hated him. They hated what he stood for. So they got some people that were, at that time, they were trying to come up with accusations against him as to reasons that they could put him to death. And so some of them were saying, for example, that he said that he would, destroy the temple and raise it again by his hands and in 3 days, and all these things. But Caiaphas, the high priest, knew that none of those kind of things were going to incite the crowd, nor was it going to be a cause that he could take to the Roman leaders to have Jesus crucified or killed. And so they had to find a reason for that to happen. So while they were kind of questioning Jesus, Jesus just remained silent. He didn't say a word. But that would have been Jesus' style. He knew why he was there, and he would make his point when it was time to make his point. Meanwhile, Peter was outside. And Peter, while he was around the fire with the guards and some other people that were there, there was a servant girl of the high priest that was there. And she looked over at Peter and said to Peter, weren't you one of his disciples? Weren't you a follower of Jesus Christ? And he looked at her and he said, no, I wasn't one of her followers. And she went away for a while. She came back a second time and she looked again. She said, I'm sure you were one of his followers. Peter said at that time, he says, no, I wasn't one of his followers. Leave me alone. So she went away, and at that time he used some pretty gruff language, cursing as he said that to her, thinking that would not tip his hat that he was with Jesus by way of talking foully, which Jesus never did. But at the same time, then Jesus was inside when this was happening outside. And finally, Caiaphas just said, I've had enough. Anything that we're talking about here is not going to really get Jesus into any kind of trouble. He said, so maybe I can just deal with Jesus directly and see what he has to say for himself. And so he comes up to us and he says to him, so tell me, are you really the Son of God? Are you the Messiah? And it was at this time that Jesus was going to proclaim to the religious leaders that were there that day a very, very powerful thing of what he was going to say. And he said, yes, I am. I am the Messiah. Yes, I am the Son of God. And he says, and you will see the Son of Man in days to come, sitting at the right hand of God. Now, when he said that, what he was ultimately saying was not only that he was the Messiah, that he was the Son of God, but in time he would rule and reign over all the earth. He was actually making a claim to the Old Testament in the book of Daniel, where Daniel talks about the Son of Man ruling in righteousness and ruling the nations. And that's exactly what about from a throne in heaven. And that's exactly what Jesus was doing. He was saying, I am that Son of Man. He was saying, I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God. And also, God's given me authority to rule over this planet and all the cosmos. That's kind of the end game of what God's setting up here in the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, we really didn't know that at the time, but Jesus did, and the Father did. And that's the important thing. With that, Caiaphas grabbed his garments, which they would do in that day, and he ripped the garments, saying, it's blasphemy. What else do we need? He's claiming himself to be the very Son of God. And they knew then that they had enough that they could probably present before the Roman government in order to have Jesus killed. And if not, they could start incite a big enough riot to where that might lead to it. Well, meantime, as they're getting ready to take Jesus now in front of Pontius Pilate, Peter is outside in the courtyard still, and the girl that had talked to him and confronted him those 2 times was talking with some of the other guards and people that were there. Finally, they came over and said, we know that you were the one that was there with Jesus. We know you're one of his disciples. Come on, just admit it. And Jesus said, I didn't know him. I don't know him. And the 3rd time that he denied him, twice to a little servant girl, and then also this other group that was there. That time he heard the cock crow, the rooster crow, one more time. And he remembered the words that Jesus had said, Peter, as much as you say you'll die for me tonight, before the rooster crows, before the sun even comes up, before it crows twice, you'll have already denied me 3 times. And at that point, Peter went away grieved because he knew that he wasn't able to fulfill that which he thought he was able to fulfill. He thought he was stronger than that. He thought that he had his fear more in control. He thought that he understood what was happening and who Jesus was more than that. But he really didn't. I don't think you can hold anything against Peter for that. I mean, I was there. And when they came after me, they took the garment I was dressed in and I ran away naked. The other disciples all ran away. Something that we all did. You can think that, well, maybe if I was there, I wouldn't have done it. I would have stayed with Jesus. But if you would have been there, you don't know. But everybody that was there was so afraid that that's what they did do. And I don't think you can hold that against Peter or me or anybody else. It's just human nature to do that from time to time. Anyway, they took Jesus before Pilate, and there was this conversation that he had with Pilate. Pilate ultimately asked him a bunch of questions, and Jesus did what he always did. He just remained silent. And finally he said, is it true that you're the king of the Jews? And he just looked at Pilate and he said, it is true. I am the king. I am their king. And he was referring to not the fact that he was going to try to overthrow the Roman government, but basically it was just that he was a king in a religious sense, and in a broader sense, he was their king. Now, they didn't see it, and maybe Pilate felt threatened, but history tells us, and at that time, Pilate was just kind of a weak governor anyway. I don't think Pilate really even thought that at all. So Pilate, not really wanting to kill Jesus, even for saying that, like, okay, big deal. So he tried to come up with a plan on how it is that he could save Jesus, knowing that Jesus was innocent, but also knowing that they sought to kill him because they were jealous of him, meaning the religious leaders. So he came up with this ploy the next morning. At that time of the year, during the Passover, they would traditionally let one of the prisoners, and it was always a political prisoner, they would let one of them go, and the other ones that were sentenced to death would die that day. And it just happened to happen on the same day, the day of the Passover lamb sacrifice. And so he got before the people, meaning Pilate. He said, "I've got to ask you a question. It's customary for me to release one or the other, and so I have two different men here, and I would be willing to release one. One of them's name was Barabbas Jesus, which ironically his name was Jesus too, but let's just use it Barabbas. And the other Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ, who says he's your king. Which one do you want me to let go?" Well, when that happened, you see, the religious leaders already had in mind that that was going to happen. And they knew that if they could get out there and work up the crowd, that the crowd would follow them. And I guess that's one of the dangerous things that we have to learn today, is that when people whip up the crowd easily follows. And the only thing I can say is be warned when somebody's trying to stir emotion in you to speak out against somebody, to do evil to another person. And so they said, "Do you want us to release Barabbas or do you want us to release Jesus?" And the religious people and those that they had planted out there said, "Barabbas, Barabbas, Barabbas," who was a known murderer. And Jesus had done no crime. And so as the crowd went and they began to yell, anybody that would yell out for Jesus of Nazareth, they would quiet, and pretty soon the crowd was crying out, "Release to us Barabbas, release to us Barabbas." And he said, "Well, what do you want me to do with Jesus?" And he said, again, the religious leader starting, "Crucify, crucify, crucify, crucify." And it just in this cadence began to grow. Well, Pilate wasn't comfortable with that. But he also knew that he couldn't deal with an insurrection because he was already on a weak footing with Rome for being known as a weak governor of the area. So he finally had to give in, and he said, "Fine, you want him crucified? You can crucify him." And he took him over, and he gave him over to the guards, and the guards took him out. And they took him out of where Pilate was in his residence and out into the praetorium, or another little area out there outside of his home. And they put a robe on his back, and they put a cloth over his head, and they began to beat him, and they began to mock him. And they began to say, "Who hit you now? Prophesy to us now, O prophet of God." And they laughed at him, they spit on him. Ultimately, what happened was they took him out of there, and they began the journey all the way down to the place of the skull, where they were going to crucify him, making him carry his own cross. There's so much that can be said there. So much that happened in his life that I think it's probably better that we talk about his crucifixion next week and end with the idea that Jesus is headed there. And he's headed there because the religious leaders sent him there. And the religious leaders got the people worked up. You know, I can tell you that in my last 2,000 years of being here, since the death of Jesus, I've seen that same scenario worked up time and time and time again, about getting the people all worked up to be against someone, to hate someone, to marginalize someone. And the only thing I can say is it's the rare man or woman who doesn't fall for that, who sees past that and looks at what the issue really is before they issue a judgment, especially when it comes about concerning somebody's life or death or their well-being. I would hope that you listening today, that you would see that what happened to Jesus can happen today when we don't keep our minds right. And those people were guilty. The Jews were guilty. They were guilty of crucifying Jesus Christ. They all shared in the guilt because none of them chose to speak out against it. But there's two other things that really come to mind in closing that I just want to bring up. The first was back in the garden when he was arrested. He looked at them and he said to them, he says, "You guys come out with swords and clubs. You could have arrested me in the light, but you've done this in order that Scripture might be fulfilled." that what the prophets said would come about. What Jesus was basically saying was, you guys are here, and in some ways you're here of your own free will. But the other side of it is that God has a plan. God has a sovereign plan. God foretold this by the prophets in the Old Testament, that this day would come. The day that Judas would betray me with a kiss, and you would come with sticks and stones to carry me away. It was because, even though you don't see it or know it, it was necessary for me to do this. That if God was going to advance the human race with what he wanted to do with fallen man, it had to be through me that it was done. There was no other way. You see, if there was another way than when he's praying in the garden, he said, God, if there's any other way for them to be restored to the dignity of their true humanity because of sin, if there's any other way to achieve what it is that you want to achieve, do it. Well, why wouldn't God do that, the Father, if there was no other way, or if there was another way? So there couldn't have been another way other than what it was that Jesus had to go through. So what I'm saying is it was necessary for Jesus to go through that. There was no other way. There was no other plan. And when Jesus said yes to that plan, he was saying yes to humanity and to their future and to a better future for those that choose to participate with him in the future, that say yes to him the same way that Mary said yes. And I guess the second thing is when I asked him, and they said, are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah? And he quite frankly said, I am. I'm the Son of God. And the day is going to come after you crucify me. He didn't say this directly, and after I'm resurrected. And I'm going to ascend to my Father, and I'm going to sit on the right hand of his power on high. And you're going to see me sitting there with my Father in power, with all the angels below me worshiping me. And then you'll know that I have dominion over all of creation. They didn't know it, but he knew it. And he knew that part of that, of defeating sin, death, and the devil, it was necessary to submit to God's plan. And in the midst of that in submitting to it, that the end of that would be this beautiful end for him. It didn't mean that he wasn't going to suffer crucifixion and pain. He knew that he was going to, short term. But the long-term story is what's important. That is that he sits at the right hand of God to this very day, judging the nations, judging men's hearts, and will forevermore. A good judge that did nothing wrong here on the earth, but paid the price for your sin and my sin. And the question is the same way that Mary said yes to his incarnation and the birth, and that Jesus said, yes, I know it's necessary for me to do this, and so I submit to your will. The answer now is yes. Or would you say yes to following Jesus? To believing that he is the Son of God? If you believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, it's never too late to say yes to him. Yes to God. Yes to following him. Yes to being one of his disciples. If you do that, I promise your life will change. Next week we'll talk about his death. The profound things that happened before that, during that, and 3 days after that. God bless you, and I hope you say yes to God today. I'll see you next week.